Well, hi, hello, Elizabeth. It's so nice to see you. How are you?
Thank you so much. I'm just doing great and so happy to be with you, Bogomil.
I've been following your work, your posts, your writing, and you got me really inspired. And some questions came up, and I thought I'll reach out to you, and you were kind enough to accept my invitation to speak with me today. So thank you.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
I like to jump in right away with my conversations, and I like to ask my guests about those early days, about the beginning, about the childhood and upbringing, and how you think that time influenced you, your career, your curiosity today, if you indulge me.
Well, thank you. That's always a challenging question, isn't it? Because our childhoods tend to be so rich, and what do we pick out? But I was thinking that I was sort of, intensely curious always in my life, and I found my own baby book quite recently. The baby book my mother kept for me as I was born, and she was raising me. And she said my first words were sit still. Most babies say mama or papa.
Uh-huh.
Mine apparently were sit still. So I reflected on that and I thought, okay, I guess I'm getting a little bit of a picture. And I can say that that sort of describes my life. I don't sit still very long for anything. I like to think of myself as being pretty speedy. Sometimes I get frustrated by the fact that I think people might be holding me back. And so those are some of the important life lessons, actually, that I've had to come to terms with. But my childhood was sort of formed, by many of these ideas that I would pick up. I read voraciously and I was curious and interested about everything. But I was born and raised in a very small town, a village actually, in northern Canada. And so my dream and my imagination was always, how fast can I get out of this little town? And it was my ambition was to find a way to go out and explore the world. It was a memory I've always had. And I remember then at 16, about to turn 16, and my brothers were asking me, well, now that you're 16, you're going to get a job and go off and make a living. And I said, no, what I want is a driver's license and I want to drive out of town. And in fact, I did. I got a scholarship at the age of 17 and went directly into university and managed to get my first degree by the time I was 19. So then I was thinking, well, I'm 19. That's the age that many Canadians start their first year of university. And I was graduating the same September they were going through intake. I wondered, now what am I going to do? So I went to India. And it was again my way of trying to understand a world that was far greater than my own. And I was thrilled by what I learned at the university. I was like quite inspired and moved by learning and by the adventure of learning and meeting people with so many different perspectives that I didn't want to lose that sense of wonder and adventure. And so I went as sort of a volunteer to work in India. And so I would say that, if you ask me about my childhood, I've always had that spirit of wonder and curiosity, but it's also been tied to entrepreneurship, interestingly. Because if you know or have children who go to school, they're always raising money, right? You have to sell, holiday wrappings or holiday cards or books or CDs and records, the good old days. And we'd have to do fundraising. And I would wind up winning prizes. They didn't give you cash prizes, but I could win these things that I only dreamt that maybe people who had lots of money could have. Like I had a record player, I won a bicycle, I won the big prizes. And so I recognized that that spirit of restlessness and curiosity had to follow through in my life. I'm academically very curious, but how do you translate that into a career? And so that was the fun and the dilemma.
I love what I'm hearing. So many fascinating ideas. Sitting still. I like to sit still, but I choose where I sit, and I even gave a TED talk about the fact that ideas don't come to me when I sit at a desk. I'd rather sit on the floor, on the couch, anywhere else. And I like being in motion in that sense. So not being at a desk, for me, it's a source of inspiration. You mentioned a small town. I grew up in a small town. And I remember this saying that Morgan Freeman has. He said that the bus leaves town every day. It's your choice. You're going to be on it or not. And I always thought that you always have that choice. If you want to go somewhere and see the world, you can be on that bus. So I like that image.
I love it too. I have to say, though, I also raised my kids that way. My husband and I were always on the go and moving places. And so my kids grew up like third culture kids. We didn't know there was a name for it at the time, and I didn't know it was a bad thing. I thought this was the greatest thing on earth, that I could offer them something that I had only dreamt of as a child, that you could, experience so many different lives, cultures, languages. And so we took them everywhere we went and exposed them to as much as we could, only to discover when they hit their late teens that they got very angry. And they said, Mom, it's just not fair. Wherever we go now, no matter where we go, people say, where are you from? And we have no idea how to answer them. They have French names. They're Canadian citizens. They lived in America and in France. One went to school in Italy for a while. They're back in Canada studying. And so it's the kind of question, of course, that comes up in life, and they're stumped. So yeah, there's consistency, but there's also a consequence.
But there's a great richness to the life lived that way too, the adventure. And I think you grow to appreciate it down the road, maybe not in the moment. I think it takes a bit of time. I was born in Poland. I went to schools around Europe. I spent most of my adult life in New York, and you're finding me in the Dominican Republic right this minute. And so I'm Polish, I'm European, I'm American. And when I sit down with people, they try to figure out, where do I belong? And I feel like I feel at home in many places, and I think that's the shortest answer.
Well, the last comment that I was going to make is that when you are shaped by so many cultures, I think one finds oneself in a space of almost translating the many different cultures, because we don't have this one point of view, because people say, well, where are you from? Or what do you think about this? And I think that richness of our history and our educations and our experiences informs our perception and our way of integrating new information. And I find that it really helps in many ways, because, I can hear from the point of view that I was raised with, but I've lived different points of view. And so I can find myself being able to understand and maybe explain things in another person's language. And I don't mean the actual language they're speaking, but in terms of their appreciation, their understanding, their experience. And so I think that idea of being a person who sort of straddles many borders puts us in a unique place to be able to see and interpret the world.
The world is much more nuanced than we think. And I think the more we see, the more people we interact with, we realize there are different perspectives, and we all see things differently. Pico Iyer, who is a writer and traveler, I'm sure you're familiar with his name. He has this saying that you have to leave the place where you are to get to know yourself. So travel is not only about getting to know other people and seeing other cultures, but also discovering more about yourself. And there are parts of yourself that, in his words, you can't discover without leaving the place where you are, which is a very powerful revelation. Elizabeth, I'm very curious about the work you do. You kind of touched on it, you led up to it, but tell me more about what kind of work you do.
Well, I've had an interesting and varied career, actually. And what I've been doing for the last 12 years is I took the experience I had of leading teams and projects, etc. And I identified the fact that a lot of us who wind up in leadership wind up there almost by accident. I mean, you wind up in leadership by virtue of your competencies. But your competencies and your expertise actually don't teach you how to lead. They help you be the expert. But the distinction is that when you begin to lead, where once you could deliver results yourself and you were recognized and incentivized to deliver these results, you now discover that you have to get results through other people. And that's a completely different relationship with those people and a different relationship with the work that we do. And so when I was going through that experience, I thought, I really think that I can take what I've learned through the school of hard knocks and the school of experience. I can bring that to practitioners and experts and professionals and show them sort of the high leverage points, the skills that can actually help them, succeed, but succeed in skills that they may not recognize that they're missing, because these reside in our blind spot. If you're good at what you do and you're promoted because of your high level of competency, you don't expect you're not competent. And so you run into all kinds of barriers and frustrations because you're not delivering the way that you expected you could do it yourself. And that's what I've been doing for 12 years now. And because I very much wanted this mobile lifestyle as well, I absolutely committed to delivering live online. So what we're doing here is what I do actually every day. But mind you, you're in the driver's seat, and I would be delivering these leadership development courses live online. And so it happened long before COVID. We were educating our audiences. People weren't sure how to behave. They were not even convinced that this was a good way or an effective way to learn. But we discovered very quickly, and those people who did participate discovered very quickly, that it was as robust as any other learning experience. But again, we had to change our perspective. We may not be face to face, and I'm not even suggesting that everything we do in a face to face environment transfers, from analog to digital directly. But we learn this new capacity to connect meaningfully with people and lead them to not only skill development, but a kind of transformation, a transformational mindset or way of thinking and a way of behaving. So that's what I've been doing for these last dozen years, and taking it a little bit further now online.
In many ways, you're ahead of time, because I feel like even more teams and leaders these days are remote or hybrid in so many ways. And I think it's a new skill set, not just going from being competent, as you said, to become nominated to be a leader, but then managing teams that are across time zones. You and I were coordinating this call, thinking about what's your time, what's my time, given that it's always in motion, but it's very tricky. I was a member of a Toastmaster club in New York years back, and there was one individual there who loved giving a talk to his entire team every Monday. He worked at one of the big businesses in New York, and he just loved the visceral experience of feeling the energy of the room. And I think of him now and then, because I imagine that his team these days is not in one place at the same time. We all had to adjust. You have some thoughts about that? How do you do that in a more virtual world that we live in?
There are these wonderful opportunities, and I was just going to say, one of them, interestingly, is sort of reflecting specifically on your comment about this person who was very energized when he gave these weekly talks. On X/Twitter, there is a service that's available called Spaces. And I don't know if you're familiar, if you've been on Spaces, but I invite your audience to check this out. So it's like a TED Talk, it's like podcasting, but it's live. And what's different is that it's a conversation. And so we go on Spaces and we have these conversations. So I launched my own space. I had heard about it about 5 days before this. It was Christmas. I said, okay, well, I won't do it on Christmas Day, so I'm going to wait a week.
Mhm.
And then I launched Spaces the very next week, and I've been hosting a weekly space on Twitter or X. And the kind of energy I found that transformative compared even to the live cohort classes that I deliver, because it's a genuine conversation like we're having now. We put out a question or a challenge. We bring guests to come in and comment on those questions. And then the audience that comes in, they ask for the mic and they can also participate in the conversation. So it is a very dynamic way. And you can think of it in terms of, teaching people. But the important thing that you asked about is how do you facilitate? How do you
Mhm.
facilitate a conversation when you have this technology as the intermediary? And so there are a skill set that you can acquire, that you can practice. And so for those project leaders, project managers, and so on that are now leading teams across time zones and borders and languages, countries, states, etc. There's a series of techniques that you want to deploy that creates this kind of engagement. And
Mhm.
so it's far less talking
Mhm.
and far more, inviting that conversation or providing people with activities, but the activities that actually give them greater insight into their experience and or working with people in the room, because of course you can do that as well. You can do small breakout groups, you can do the presentations of all kinds. So it's multimedia. So the key really is the facilitation, and that is having a facilitator that can guide that conversation and keep everybody engaged in what's going on. Otherwise you just have people multitasking, right? Shopping
I have.
online while they're taking a course.
I've seen that happen in conference rooms in my life more than once. But the interesting thing that you mentioned that made me think of the person in the back of the room. In the investment world, I manage money for families, individuals, build portfolios, and I always think of investment discussions that I was a part of. The voice you sometimes
Mm,
want to hear is the voice that's in the back of the room. It might not be the
mhm,
bravest, the loudest person in the room, but they have something to share that can move this idea from one side to the other. And I feel like
mhm.
in a physical space, that person might feel a little bit uncomfortable raising their hand and speaking up. But in a virtual environment, it kind of levels the playing field. There is no back of the room. And there are moments where I feel like I get to hear voices that I always wanted to hear, and they're more visible. So I don't know if you have thoughts about that, but I realize that maybe that, I don't want to say shy, but somebody that doesn't feel as comfortable speaking up in a larger room with a bigger audience, that person has a chance to speak up.
It's been my experience too. I can just validate exactly what you're saying. The diversity of the ideas and the voices that come into an audio room is really very different, and in a virtual teaching room as well. One quick example I had was delivering a corporate program, and so there might have been about 28 people in a virtual classroom. And there were director level people, so there would have been maybe a handful, half a dozen of the directors, and the rest were all the people who reported to the directors. And the way the class is designed is that you're asking people to do things on the various interfaces. So they can be chatting, they can type in some of their answers, they can come in on audio, they can go into the breakout rooms and come back and report into the main room. And so because we have these multiple interfaces, people were comfortable pretty quickly, because if they weren't comfortable speaking out at first, they could engage in the conversation, and they found their voice by using the different channels. But here was the very remarkable thing. Before we took our first break, I started getting private notes from the other directors, and I'm going, uh-oh, when you see the messages pop up and you're busy teaching, you can't read them right away, and you think, oh, something's going wrong. So then we took the break and I read the messages, and there were exclamations all over it. Like, I can't believe it. The particular director has been working in the company for something like 7 years, and at every quarterly meeting, they had never heard his voice ever. And this person was talking and providing rich context, and he was so valuable. But what was so interesting is that the room lit up because he found his voice in that room. So I think I can just validate that this is really an opportunity for people to discover their voice in a safer way, psychologically safe.
I love the sound of that. And that's the voice I want to hear. And I think that's the voices we want to hear in so many moments when there's a big decision being made or a discussion, right? You want to have the wide range of opinions. In the investment world, you don't want to miss anything. If there's somebody in the room that has something valuable to say, what's the environment we can create to allow them to speak up and feel comfortable sharing? And I love that example that you shared. I want to ask you about success and failure. And you wrote about it and you have some interesting thoughts about it. The reason I bring it up, in the investment world, now and then, there are good investments, bad investments. And I have this saying, well, not mine, but I like to use it, that the success has many fathers and the failure is an orphan. And I see it in so many situations where if the investment does well, everybody claims that they came up with it. And if it does poorly, nobody wants to own up to it. Can you talk about success and failure from your perspective?
Well, yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because it seems as if we have a monolithic way of defining success.
Mm-hmm.
And that often means that we measure it by maybe ROI, let's say. So we have a really simple capitalist way of measuring success. If you make a lot of money, if you have a high ROI, if you're, converting people and making sales, it's a metric. It's a way to measure success. And so when we only focus on that, there are so many important aspects of true leadership that are required to be successful that can be overlooked, because the incentive structure is also designed to support those measurable metrics. So what happens to a person who happens to be, an outstanding leader, in other words, somebody who can develop the talent on their team to develop results, deliver on these results, and yet the incentive isn't for the leader who is, ensuring that the talent is getting the skills and the resources, the time and the attention that they need so that they can flourish. So I think one of the things you want to look at is, how is success defined? If it's too narrowly defined, how is that impacting your team? Because your team may be, have very different ways of being successful that still delivers on the corporate requirement, right? It's really tied to the requirements. And, in wealth accumulation, you have ways of measuring that. But we also know that business is done with and through people. And so if we only look at the metrics that measure that bottom line, we may be missing the top line. We might be missing all of the factors that fill the funnel, the pipeline towards future success. And so I would say one of the things we want to look at in success, in talking with our leaders, is to find a definition that is still measurable and that is motivational and palatable, and not just take the old definition. And I think this is probably a good time to have that conversation, because I think so many of the systems that we have in place, the processes and the systems in business as we know it today, is being radically disrupted by AI. And I don't think that I'm throwing it out as a buzzword. I think there's something that people recognize, that at a more historic and epic level, that this is a disruptive period in history. And so holding on to very old, very monolithic definitions of success and failure probably won't serve us. So how are we, it's one thing to say, well, I've been successful. What does it mean to say we will be successful in the future? Sometimes, I mean, part of history and part of what we've learned is that we say history is the best predictor of the future, right? I
Right.
don't think that's going to apply today. So what will be the basis and the foundation of success today? I think it's going to be based on a person's ability to be more agile, to deal with stressors, uncertainties, and still lead and guide people when there aren't the guarantees that we used to use to motivate people. We put them into our incentive structure and said, that's what we're aiming for. We're going to celebrate the highest, the person who sells the most, or, who has gotten the most rewards. That's the person who becomes the hero of the year for the company. And I'm not sure if that's going to suffice going forward, because we're going to have some ability to reskill, and those skills will have to be based on, in part, some of the competencies. But those competencies are emerging as we speak. I mean, look at prompt engineering. It was, everybody said, oh, let's study prompt engineering right now because that's the future. That lasted about 6 months, 8 or 9 months, somewhere in that range. Because now AI is smart enough to actually write its own prompts and correct its own prompts. So it's that kind of success is going to be the person who is willing to sort of take on that challenge, take on the risk, and guide other people through those uncertainties. I don't know if that answered your question.
I love it. And you touched on a bigger topic, which is AI, that I want to come back to in a second. But I immediately thought of a process and the outcome. And in business, in investments, we spend a lot of time on the outcome. You mentioned milestones in terms of wealth, but returns or ROI or whatever measure you look at. But focusing on the process sometimes might be more valuable. How do you pick investments? How do you make decisions, and so on? And you also touched on something that I find fascinating, the short-term versus long-term. And even those two words mean different things to different people. But if you make certain choices in terms of maximizing short-term results, let's say that you want to get this quarterly sales to a certain number, but you will sell it to people that didn't actually want it. You will surcharge clients that will not come back, and on, right? So you have to think about the long term. Maybe it's more about building the relationship and so on. It's much more nuanced, which I like that you touched on. And it's a different way of thinking of success and failure. And I like that idea that you mentioned, that if you make it very, very narrow, you might be missing a bigger point. And I think that happens quite a bit, because these days, so many things can be quantified. I mean, we have apps to measure steps and heartbeat and everything else. You can look at your day and have all the highlights. And if you say that your goal was, the 10,000 steps and you keep falling under that, you could say that it was not a good day, whatever measure you use, right? So you can really create an experience that's not very enjoyable at the end of the day. And it applies to personal life and business. But I'm curious to hear what you think about that.
I think that's foundational. It's fundamental to people to recognize the difference between sort of an extrinsic motivation and an intrinsic one. Now, you're talking about throughputs, and this is an engineering methodology, right? You have your inputs, you have your throughputs, and you have your deliverables at the end. And so post-Second World War, we've operated on processes and systems that have operated that way, and we've improved the efficiencies and effectiveness of that mechanized world. But this is what's disruptive, I think, in part about today. So you made a really interesting point that we can have a to-do list and we can check the to-do list off every day. But have you ever had the experience where you've had a to-do list, and at the end of the day, maybe at the end of the week, and maybe at the end of the quarter, you can look at your checklist and go, check, check, check. Why do I feel so bad? What have I accomplished? What's the real outcome from this? So there's a disconnect, you see, between that idea of throughput and counting everything and solving problems, for example. Because this is the idea around making, if you have a problem, you can make it go away. Isn't
Right.
that what we try to do when we solve a problem? You want that problem to get out of the way. If you have a barrier, remove the barrier so that you can sell more, or,
Hmm.
etc. But the important question, I think, is the intrinsic question. You're saying, well, wait a minute, what does this mean to us as an investor? Am I investing in the things that I believe in for today, but will serve not just me, but create value in the future? Am I a
Hmm.
real value investor, or am I a value extractor?
Hmm.
And this is one of the important conversations that I think is so important for every individual, no matter what practice, field, industry, trade you're in, is to take a look at the human condition. It's one thing to say, and in business, find the problem, solve the problem, and you can sell anything, right? But what if you want to create something?
Hmm.
What if in those investments you have a commitment somewhere in your consciousness or in your family or in your life to work to help resolve the climate crisis? What if that's a value that you have? But the investment portfolio and the investment advisor might say, maximize profits, maximize profits. But you might say, but if we're looking at the climate crisis, and I know that we can make some investments and there are various new instruments being introduced all of the time now around how you can invest in insurance. Insurance companies that are now insuring buildings that are built to a higher standard of environmental pressure, for example, that they're earthquake resistance, that they're not built on the shores where they're going to be flooded in the next 20 to 40 years, depending on what science you're looking at. But in other words, there's a new host of investments. But if we're only looking at the metric of sell as much as you can, maximize profits, get in, get out, etc., then are we missing the more important issues? So I would say that there are the short-term goals, the check. You want to have a checklist for the day, but if it's driving your day and driving your life, you've missed out on the most important parts of life. Well, how do you access them? By being strategic. And the strategic side is the longer term. It's like, what value can I bring to the world? What use am I? I have skills in education. I have so much to offer, but I'm applying them in a very narrow plane. And so the returns are actually quite small. If you looked at the scope of my life and all the value I could actually generate and create in the world, but I'm only creating the bottom line on, I've got 10 big investors and, I'm a success. And then you zoom out and you look at life and you have this sort of a hairline of
Hmm.
success in this vast world of value creation. Where do you want to play? Do you want to play on this flat line, or do you want to play in this greater perspective? We're not saying that there is a guarantee you'll be successful in all things, but it's the change of mind to say, I want to create value and not just extract value. But that's harder to do because there aren't as many metrics for that. In fact, we have to bring things into being instead of taking things away. Remember, problem solving is about getting rid of the barriers.
Hmm.
Creating something means you bring something in. So, think about gardening. Think about agriculture, think about forests and oceans and fisheries. We can have any number of analogies that help us to think about that. But they're self-sustaining systems.
Right.
We've come in this narrow bandwidth, and we slice and dice pieces and extract that value and say, boy, we're really successful.
Hmm.
But what are we creating? We're creating damage and pollution, and there's such a high consequence to these activities that we're extracting the real genuine value that we could create. So I think that that's an important aspect of leadership. I don't think leaders just have to be good at their jobs. I think they have to be on purpose. And I think we have to tap into that. I think we have to tease it out in our own lives. I don't think some people might know it. Some people might actually have that clarity. Some of us just discover it through experience. But being a leader on purpose helps that leader to then develop the talent of their team members in this kind of mindset. And we know that when they've studied motivation now since post 1950s, and we know that intrinsic motivators are multipliers of performance. Extrinsic motivators are merely mathematical. You have exponential motivators and mathematical motivators. And so my focus on leadership and how you can be successful, etc., is a definition of leadership that doesn't say, oh, I got to find really good followers. It's how do I create more leaders? And I think that taps into the diversity.
It makes me think of the CEOs that we would like to have run the companies that we invest in. And I had a couple of conversations on this podcast that you want a leader that sees this as some sort of a higher calling, pride in the work that they do, soul in the game. Because the financial incentives only get them that far. And at some point, it's something else that really drives them. And usually it's the founders, but it doesn't have to be the founders that keep on showing up way past any financial milestone that maybe initially motivated them. They just want to do something better than they did the day before, improve the business, serve more people, provide a better product, and so on. And they show up although they could have retired, and they don't. And they continue to. So once you find an individual like that, it's fascinating to watch what they are capable of. And I think it's tricky to replicate and reverse engineer, but it's fascinating to notice and acknowledge that you're experiencing or dealing with somebody that has, I would call it a true calling. That's the only thing they can do, want to do, and it's something they love to do. And it's way beyond any financial incentive that you could offer.
I would even posit that I think that most people wish that were true for them, but they don't know how to access it. And I'm suggesting that everyone can access it. And that's part of the skill set that I like to focus on. Anybody, listen, you go into any bookstore or go online to Amazon, there are 20, 30,000 books on business. There are another, 20 to 40,000 books on leadership. So there are countless sources of information that's all roughly the same, but with slight variations. It's like, Baskin and Robbins ice cream. It's ice cream, but you have all these flavors. But what I'm suggesting is that there's a fundamental shift. And leadership, we don't even want to define it the way it's been defined in the past, because I don't think it's going to be adequate for the challenge of today and the future. And I think that when you have disruption, people will either, it's not hard to imagine, they will be victims or victors. But we want to change that landscape and say we want to prepare as many people as possible with the skills that are available to them, such as that idea of being able to connect meaningfully with other people, being able to hear all the voices in the room, creating an environment where it's safe enough for people to challenge, not just speaking truth to power, which I used to think was the ultimately dangerous as well. We all know that when you work in business and in institutions. But the greater value is speaking truth to our peers. And it means that we can challenge the project or the idea based on this depth of diversity and experience that's available, and correct the project without threatening the person. And you might say, well, okay, that makes sense, but how do you actually do it? Most people are very defensive, right? You say, I have a different point of view, and they're going, what's wrong with my idea? And if they don't say it out loud, that they pull back because they're feeling defensive, because they think that there's so much at risk. And the leader's role is to create that space where people can bring their, the very best, not just the most. Who's going to bring the most? And you burn people out and you drive people, and they become shallow, and then they use tricks or they use methods that undercut the quality in order to be, the most. What if the metric was be the best, but it was on
Hmm.
the leader to help people develop their very best of their capacity? How much more innovative would we be? How many more problems could we actually, dissolve so that we could create greater value in the world? And so I guess it sounds a little bit too Pollyannish in some ways, but it's very much anchored in over 2,000 years of human relations, what we do know about what motivates humans. And it's the only thing that we can hold on to, given the technological race that we're in.
Hmm.
We better turn to the one factor that we might actually know well and get to know better, and that's the human element, because the technology is kind of taking on a life of its own. How are we going to develop our capacity to to create more value, that rather than being either the victim or the victor of that disruption? Let's create a redefine how we go about what we do.
I like that aspect of it's all about people at the end of the day. So in my profession, I work with clients. I know the families, I know the stories, I know the people. And then on the other side, the money is invested in businesses, and I know who is running them and why and so on. So it's really people on both sides, people that trust me with their capital, and then I turn around and I trust other people with the capital of the clients to do something that will allow that capital to safely grow within some metrics over time and serve the next generation or two or more. That's the idea. But it's really about people, which brings me back to the AI question. You write about it quite a bit, and there's no week that passes that somebody doesn't bring up AI. And I don't mean headlines in the news, I mean real life experience. And only last week I spoke to somebody who is a designer, and he can see the difference in his field with design, how it's competitive, but you're competing against the apps and the software. And then I talked to a bookkeeper, random conversations, but somehow the weather doesn't come up in the conversation, but AI does. AI became the number one conversation topic, how it changes the tools that they use and so on. And sometimes in an empowering way, sometimes in a scary way, that it will take away some of the work that they are getting. And you talk about the need to reskill, which you touched on. But I'm curious about your big picture view about AI. We can't deny that it's happening.
Yeah, I think it goes without saying, in a way, that AI is occurring. And I think if I'm like so many of us, I'm just observing. I'm
Mm-hmm.
reading what's available every day. I'm reading what's being put out in the press and put out by the CEOs that are leading these teams of these various, the systems that are being made available to the public. But I think that if you try and understand and you hear how they talk about it, it's speeding up exponentially. Where 18 months ago, when they released ChatGPT and OpenAI, they talked about, oh, in 10 and 20 years, we'll have such and such capacity. And now we know that the AI itself is generating faster and faster iterations, and its ability to learn and adopt this information and then, generate new information from it is also speeding up. And so there is an element, I don't want to be alarmist. I'm just trying to be a realist in this case and say we need to be aware. We really need to be looking at this with eyes wide open. And we can't predict, they can't predict. Even the people who have done the programming, they're saying that it's now running far ahead of us and far ahead of schedule. So I'm not suggesting anybody decide, oh, well, we should go into programming, we should go into prompt writing, we should go into app development, because those are specific applications. I think what we need to be doing is consider what will it will be disruptive, and so what will it mean for humans in the future? I think that these jobs will be automated. The ones that you just described, they'll be automated. We'll be able to do things literally in minutes that used to take people and businesses and organizations a fair amount of time to deliver on those projects. They will be delivered and delivered very fast. So what is it that we can do? And those are the important questions for every individual to say, how do I play in this new playing field? What do I need to know and learn? And that's why I come back to the essentials around reskilling. You can get technical skills, but I'm suggesting that we're going to look at how do you adopt change more readily. If you're leading a team and the software keeps changing, or you're leading an agency, a design agency, and you might have $1 million worth or $5 million worth of business running through a design agency in a given year. And you know that your clients have a new option, and that option will be to automate it either themselves or hire one person that can handle it versus giving the work to the whole agency. So we have to look at how we handle disruption and change. And I would say a lot of the skills that we need are based on that ability to connect meaningfully with people. In other words, take yourself for an example. You're talking about the investments and the basis on which you make your recommendations to your clients. And essentially, they want to be able to sleep well at night. So it has to be a safe investment. But they also are looking forward to generational wealth. That may be another one of their objectives. You're the translator again, as we talked about at the top of the hour. When we've had many different experiences, we wind up being able to see the world from many different points of view. And I would say one of the skills that investors might be looking at is how do we align what people's real values are? How do you even learn to discover what people's values are beyond the typical measure and metric of money? And say, right. I see, we've got a clear vision of what it is and how much we want to create for the future. Mm-hmm. But we have different ways of generating that wealth now. We can maximize year over year, make big investments and not care, not spend too much time on those investments. Or you as an investor can look at that family and that generation and say, here are some of the things that you value the most. Mm-hmm. We can actually take more time, do deeper investigations. Maybe the money will sit there a little bit longer, but if in the long term it's generational wealth, do you want to invest in things that will help protect, environmental ecosystems, whether it's, climate or seas, forests or fisheries, air quality or water and sanitation, access to food, taking care of populations that are underserved or facing military crisis. I don't know. Is that too much to ask of an investor?
I think the mandate is
I'm curious.
Getting bigger. No, I love the question. I think the mandate is getting bigger both for the leadership and investors, for all of us. And I always think of a consumer. And one of the first books that I read about investing was Peter Lynch's book, and he basically said how an everyday consumer has already so much knowledge about the products. We make decisions, we make choices, we pick things from the shelf. So the voting, in a way, starts very early on. It doesn't really start at the CEO level. It happens at the CEO level, but it happens in the morning when you walk down the aisle in the supermarket and you choose this product over the other product. That's a vote that has an impact. When I think of reskilling, when I was listening to you, I launched businesses in my lifetime, including the investment firm where I work now. And I always thought of it as, where do I add the most value? And what are the different pieces I can outsource, find somebody else or an app and software to do for me? And it's the most human aspect, the people, the relationships. That's where I add the most value on both sides that we talked about. You write about storytelling, which made me think of a very powerful thing that apps maybe will empower us to write better sentences, but the actual storytelling that grips the heart and the emotion, that belongs to a human. I still believe so. And the second aspect that you write about that I really like is trust. And trust is such a powerful word to me. Charlie Munger used to say that you need the seamless web of trust to do business. And that's something you develop between humans. It's not machines. Machines can empower us to do things, but it's between two people. At the end of the day, two CEOs sit down and decide to merge two businesses, two cultures, two institutions. It's a human-to-human experience. So when I think of reskilling, I'm curious about your thoughts about those two things, storytelling and trust, that you write about quite a bit, and I really liked your thoughts about those topics.
I like how you've put this idea of, repeating what Charlie Munger has said about it. And I think of it as multiple threads or as a tapestry, that sometimes we think that trust is almost like a direct line between myself and yourself, for example, and then, it's reciprocated. But trust it's based on time, and it's based on velocity and mass and weight and complexity, right? So in other words, trust isn't built necessarily on any one conversation or transaction. It's built on sort of a plentitude of engagements with people, and even with third, fourth party people, reputational trust, all of these different types of trust. But fundamentally, I think about trust as a trust fund. I think that each one of us, when we think about how do you go about creating resilient, strong trust, I think about trust as something that you may be given, and you are entrusted with that person's good faith and goodwill. And our job isn't just to keep it safe and bury it or lock it up in a box. It's to enrich that trust, but never to take from it ourselves. That's a layman's understanding? Is that a fair interpretation of what a trust fund might be? You don't take money out of the trust. Your job is to be the guide, the shepherd of that trust. So I took that definition sort of to heart and said, gee, well, is that what it is when we deal with other human beings? That in fact, when somebody even implies, I trust you enough to have this conversation or to have a meeting or to listen to your pitch or your proposal or to learn from you, that it isn't just transactional, it's actually transformational. So I see it as both. Transactional is two dimensions, right? It's based on the exchange. We've been exchanging since the Phoenicians across the Mediterranean Sea. So we've been doing transactions long for the millennia. And it works. It's a great mechanism, right? Look at how civilization has flourished on these transactions. So I'm not complaining about that transaction. But what we also know now is that relationships can be transactional, but they can be transformational. But trust is the third piece. And that is when we say, I have got your back. You've entrusted me with our relationship. So I'm not going to try and scam you, rip you off, trick you, cheat you, take advantage of you in any way. I really have your best interest at heart. And that's really the foundation, like a three-legged stool. It's the solid, strong, structural foundation of trust. It has to be three-dimensional. If you go into life looking at life as a relationship with these three elements, it changes everything. It's like the difference between watching TV and then, stepping outside into a garden or going down to the sea after you've gotten a postcard, right? They're different experiences. And that's where I think it's tied to storytelling, because storytelling isn't, you have jokes, you have entertainment, you have movies, gaming. We have all these vehicles for, using story to entertain us. But I talk about and think about storytelling as a way of revealing ourselves to earn the trust of other people.
True.
And so it means we have to be vulnerable. And that's the heart of the story that I think, were just touching on.
Mhm.
Because machines don't have that experiential piece. And it's not just extracting the insights and the lessons, it's letting people into my heart. Like, this is when I was really vulnerable. This is when I was really scared. This is when I gave up and I thought there was no hope. And when you tell that story to people, they go, wow, like, that's so real. I have either had the experience, or that's an experience I'm not sure I ever want to have. But we relate at the most human level when we are vulnerable, partly because we don't show those vulnerabilities. The way our society post Second World War, and I simply reference it that way, is because mechanization literally, became a part of our daily life, and it certainly was, systemized in the, working in the plants and so on. So I mean, it became a way that we were employed. It became a way of distributing wealth. It became a way of optimizing our manufacturing, products and services and delivery. And so it became very mechanized. So in a way, AI may not be that different from what we're already used to. But because it's as smart, or they're saying now, give it 18 more months, it's going to actually exceed the smartest human being. That AI is actually going to be smarter than people within 18 months. How do we bring value? How do we live in a world where every piece of information, every problem can be solved by some external force? I would say it comes back to my original thesis that I kind of alluded to initially. There are intrinsic values and motivators. There are extrinsic ones. Storytelling is deeply intrinsic, but it's also transferable on your breath. When you speak a story, you have transported all of your experience through the emotion, something that's quite tangible. You can hear the airwaves in your ears. You can feel your mouth get dry if you're feeling stressed or anxious. You can feel your heart beating faster or sweaty palms as you listen to a story. So stories are tangible, but they're intrinsically tangible. Mechanization is tangible, but it's all extrinsic. So we are the masters of the human experience. It is an intrinsic event. It's an intrinsic life. And that's where the value resides. And how do we get to our stories? Through insight, right? Insight, I call it insight, hindsight, and foresight. But those are all intrinsic. We have to think back to our past. I drew that little story about my childhood when I opened up my baby book, right? I only found it, sort of rediscovered it about 18 months ago, found it in a box in an attic, right? And I opened it up and I thought, oh, look at this. And laughed out loud when I saw, baby's first words, sit still. I could see my mother just trying to keep me calm. But that's an experience, right? And it conveys, the fabric, the tapestry. You said, well, what is trust? It's this kind of fabric. And you might trust me because if I've entrusted you with this story of my baby, from my baby book, you might say, well, I know some things about Elizabeth. I think that she's pretty authentic. How do we become authentic? By telling our stories. And you can write the story, you can speak the story, you can video the story, you can go on TED Talks and you can make movies, right?
Mhm.
But it's only when you see, that's the truth. That's the vector that you were looking for. Stories and trust. When stories are true, that's where the human resides, because that's where authenticity is. And that's what distinguishes artificial intelligence from authenticity. We have the authentic life experience, education, skills, training, doing the work. But our stories are what make us come to life, I think.
Even this very podcast, people listen to the whole hour and then write me a very long email about what it was, how it impacted them, only because it's two humans that sit down, talk, and share their stories, their experience. And I think a couple of things happen. People realize that we have so much in common. We have the same stories, the same obstacles, the same challenges. And it's very inspiring to see other people find a way to overcome them. And at the same time, it's something very relatable and real. If it was an AI-generated conversation that lasts an hour based on the things that are more searchable, clickable, I have a feeling we would have lost this audience a long time ago. But it's two real people talking, and you have no idea where this conversation will go. And I think that's what keeps people interested, inspired, hooked. And that's why I've been doing it, just keeping it true, honest, real. And I'm having a lot of fun with it. The people I get to meet and our conversation today, I mean, you can't replace it with any prompt and code in ChatGPT. There's nothing that can replace it. Elizabeth, I'm very curious about your definition of success. But before I ask you about that, you have a story about climbing the top of Annapurna and observing Sherpas helping you out. And then you made a big reference between the Sherpas and business and AI. Can you share that story real quick? I really liked it and I don't want us to miss it.
I was in India, and I mentioned actually when I was 19, I graduated, and I thought, oh, now what am I going to do? So I did this volunteer work in India. And just before coming back, it seemed like what a great adventure to get on a plane and fly to Kathmandu and climb in the Himalayas. Just another one of those things you do when you're 19. And so we hired, and I was traveling alone, so I was always meeting other travelers. It's not like I went with other people. I went with an organization that sent me on various missions. So I worked in, orphanages, ashrams, and leprosy villages and so on. So I did that work. But then I was also just adventurous. And so I went to Kathmandu and we hired a Sherpa that took us up Annapurna. And, it was just stunning and beautiful and hard and heavy. And the Sherpas, we had some who were carrying our backpack, and we had our own backpacks as well. And we had the guide, the actual Sherpa who took us up. And I realized that his role is, to make sure that he guides us safely to the top, but also to ensure that we get safely home and that we don't fall off the track, that we don't get hurt, that we don't take risks where there's no reward. And it's that kind of experience that's so valuable. And with that sense of confidence, we could climb, and my feet hurt and blistered, and you go through that experience. And I remember climbing, and finally we went up the riverbed for the longest way before we even started the climb. And then you do switchbacks through the forest and through the trees, and you go across scree and the mountain rubble, and if you slip, you can slip a very long way. So you're doing all the switchbacks, and then at a certain moment, you're exhausted and burned out. A few days have already gone, and you're thinking, okay, now I still have to get home and catch a flight back to Canada. And we got to the top. And as I looked up, I saw a tree of poinsettias, and the most glorious poinsettias, this bright crimson red in the sort of forest. And then as I looked a little further, I saw a patch of blue, and there was, I could see the mountains right through this small cut in the forest. And I think I was forever moved and inspired by that experience, because I knew that I was the beneficiary of all of those people who had gone before me, and that Sherpa was there to ensure that I could have an experience that was truly remarkable and unforgettable. And yet his work was never done.
Mm-hmm.
His work was always constant vigilance. And so when I considered that, I thought, that's what true leadership is. It's not just sending people out to try things. It's not, kicking people to the curb and saying, I hope you get there safely. It's actually accompanying people in a way that's empowering and instructive, develops their talent so that their confidence and competency grows. And then they can become the leaders who inspire other leaders. And that's the cascading effect that I see is the real job of leadership. We don't want to just achieve those objectives that we have quarterly, annually, etc. We have all of those as markers, as you have when you climb a mountain. You've always got the road markers, right? If you're going on or off direction. But what we really want to do is create other leaders who can continue this legacy of developing talent. And it's not that different from the uncertainty that we have with AI. We don't know who it is. We don't know when it's going to happen. We don't know what the problem or the opportunity is going to be, or the innovation, or the breakdown, the failure, a pandemic. We don't have the guarantees. So what do we have? We have Sherpas. And we can rest assured that the Sherpa may not have all the guarantees and the answers, but they have all this experience and that purpose to get us to the summit and get us back safely. And if we can create that kind of leadership and that kind of legacy, I think it's well worth the investment.
That's a beautiful image. The mountains, the Sherpa, and going up the mountain, and all the acquired knowledge and experience of the people that were there up on the mountain before you. Elizabeth, I'm very curious about your own definition of success. We talked about it in a corporate setting, business setting, but tell me more about your own definition of success. How do you think about it?
Oh, that is not an easy question. And what's probably interesting is that it's really undergoing a seismic shift right now. Mm-hmm. It's changing. And I think it is what's changing and may have been part of a trigger is AI. AI is sort of like this, the catalyst for a new way of looking at things. And yet for me, I think it's through deeper and deeper self-awareness. I think success. Now, if I take it from the extrinsic definitions I've used in the past, like many of us, I thought I was very successful when I went to, was working at the World Bank. That was the height of the idea of what I could aspire to from the little village that I grew up in. And there I was in Washington, D.C., working for a UN-based agency doing global work and working against poverty. And so it was aligned very much with the mission and passion I'd had from being quite young. So I thought I had acquired, achieved a certain level of success. And then even before I got there, I was a founding editor-in-chief of an environmental science and economics journal. And as the founding editor with the Royal Society funding this global bilingual journal, tackling problems before environment was cool. Do you remember? You don't remember. You might have read about the time when environmentalists were called tree huggers, right? It was a pejorative. You didn't have a lot of credibility if you were thought of as an environmentalist. And that was the era that we were saying if we were going to do anything vis-a-vis sustainable development, we had to change how the decision makers talked about and financed sustainable development and environmental issues, which we now know of as the climate crisis. And so we gave it a platform, we gave voice. But what was interesting about what made that successful and why I'm saying it fits in a definition of success is that we brought people from the developing world as well as from, highly capitalized worlds together in conversation. And before they didn't have a platform, they might have international meetings that always went through processes long before decision makers ever made it to a meeting. But this became a quarterly peer-reviewed journal where we had economists and scientists and people committed to health issues and boundary issues, justice issues, poverty issues, all discussing on this platform. That was another sort of innovation. It was a dream I had. It was a vision that I wanted to see fulfilled. And remarkably, it occurred. That would have been also a success. I think of that as my success as well. But when you ask me this question, I go, well, today, if I get so many followers on Twitter, is that my success? If I sell, books and courses, will that be my success? But here's my definition, if I can give you one. I think now it's being able to say that the work is never done internally, intrinsically. And it's only through self-awareness, it's only in giving up these definitions of what is success that I can become vulnerable enough to ask better questions. And in asking better and more provocative questions, it's also more dangerous because people don't want to answer hard questions. But I also believe that there are people who are committed to having those conversations. There are people that are willing to say, how do we do this? And we don't know. We can do this. And I think it's through giving voice to the farthest margins and bring those voices into the mainstream of the conversation. And I think that we can find true success if we plumb the depths of people's voices and teach people that leadership is about a cascade and not about achieving, an Oscar or that award or that bonus. I guess it's let's call it a work in progress, my definition.
I like the sound of that, work in progress. A lot of things in life don't really have an end. In the investment world, I talk about the families I work with, that they have an infinite investment horizon. They're really building something that
Beautiful.
will be taken over by the next generation. And I like the image of a Sherpa. Sometimes I feel like I play that role. And you mentioned the word, I would call it, a steward of the capital. You're just taking care of it the same way we take care of the planet, just for now, for the time we're here. But we can't really own it, make a claim on it. We're just taking care of it. I think that's how I look at it. Elizabeth, this was such a wonderful conversation. I learned a lot, and we brought up so many topics. I'll be thinking about this conversation for a while, but I'm very grateful for the time that you shared with me today. It was very generous of you, so thank you so much.
Bogomil, thank you so much for being willing to have these kinds of conversations and inviting me into your circle. And I'm grateful to you and had a lot of fun. So thank you very much for the invitation.